Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm so glad to be here with all of you, and thank you for coming. And this is not really going to focus on scholarship, so I'll just say a little bit about my background, just 5 minutes, so you give it a little context of how I came to this. And so my parents met when they were in college, and they met at the Jewish Student Union. So my mother was Jewish from an Orthodox family. My father was Scots-Irish from a Christian family, and they married and a couple kids, and so I was brought up in this sort of intercultural family where half were Christian and half were Jewish, and my father was he was brought up Protestant, was very anti-Christian or anti-organized religion. He would say things like, the Catholic Church is the biggest cult in the world, and, we didn't have a Bible in the house, not even any Bible. He was a Marxist and a social democrat, and they were very active in social justice work. I was born in Berkeley, so it kind of gives you a context of kind of my upbringing, and I did have my Jewish grandmother was very close. I was very close to her, and when I was probably 11, I started reading about religion and philosophy. I just was so fascinated, and my parents let me do whatever I wanted. They were not supportive of. They were supportive of my inquisitiveness, but not, anything about religion and so forth. And as it went on, I got more and more fascinated, and I started studying kind of Western esotericism when I was in high school, and I had a Kabbalah teacher who also was an alchemist in the traditional sense, and came in contact with this entire esoteric community in San Diego. After I graduated from high school, I just really didn't want to go to college. I just didn't fit in. I was just odd, I was an honor student and all this, but so I joined an ashram, and an Eastern ashram. And my parents, I wanted to go to college at the same time, and they said, well, if you're not living at home, we're not paying your tuition. And I said, well, I guess I'm not going to college. So I lived in the ashram for about 12 years, had a child, was married, had an arranged marriage, had a child, and then got divorced and started college when I was 30 in California. And I got a degree in religion. I was just completely gung-ho on being a religious professor of religion, and I loved the subject. And I studied it while I was in the ashram, so already for decades I'm immersed in this study. Then I went off to Harvard Divinity School, bringing my 5-year-old daughter in tow. So I was the only single mother, I think, at Harvard Divinity School, and got a degree there. And then after a few years of working as an administrator in various universities, I went off to study with the late Dr. Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who Thomas just mentioned, who was one of the probably 2 leading scholars. Wouter Hanegraaff from the Netherlands was the other in Western esoteric traditions. And that refers to such things as Kabbalah and alchemy and the history of magic and theosophy and tangential subjects like illustrated alchemical drawings that you see, and astrology, on all sorts of things, but on a very academic and interdisciplinary level. And so I decided to study with Nicholas and went to University of Wales to do that. And then he was hired at Exeter. He started a Center for Esoteric Studies, and so I was his student there for a few years. Eventually I got a doctorate in the States. But in 2009 I had I always was a practitioner. I was always involved in things like ceremonial magic, which is a Western tradition. and many other sorts of traditions like that. And so even one of my professors said, why are you going to grad school? You really aren't going to fit in because you're so experiential. And I did it anyway, but I think that was kind of a difference between me and many other people at the doctoral level, was they were much more focused on the scholarship and academics, which I did, but I was also involved in the practices. So while I was at Exeter, I needed money, of course, as any grad student does, and I thought I had been coming in contact with a lot of people and websites and so forth that were working with Mary Magdalene. And I hadn't really ever considered Mary Magdalene much. When I was very young, I became enamored of the Roman Catholic tradition and started going to Mass with friends, and then later on my own. There were no Catholics in my family at that time. There had been some earlier on the Scottish and Irish side, but none of my relatives were Catholic, so I got very fascinated with the mysticism, the saints. I mean, I think I know more about Catholicism than most Catholics in a practical way, because I was so drawn to it, although I never joined the church. So there was sort of that piece of it, and my studies in graduate school were Christianity and culture, history of Christianity, historical theology. So I was very interested in how the history of the church intersected with society and politics and history, secular history. So I was researching my dissertation, which was on modern Gnostic churches, because I already had gotten in contact with Gnostic churches years before and had been studying them. And I thought this would be a really interesting topic. And as I was doing that, and much of it on the internet, I came across people that were doing such interesting practices with Mary Magdalene, and I hadn't been aware of that. So this is in, probably the mid-2000s. And there were pilgrimages and seminars and new books out, and people were talking about meditations and envisioning her in new ways, new theologies of her and Yeshua. And I thought, well, this would be a great book. I was thinking along the lines of a more scholarly book, kind of sociology, Mary Magdalene. So I wrote up a book proposal at that time, and I submitted it to a friend of mine's editor, and I thought, it's just obvious it's going to be a go, right? It's just such a natural thing, and it's so going to be so popular. And she said, it'll probably get published, but it's not going to sell enough copies to make it worth my while to handle it for 15% of, whatever. And so she gave it back to me, and I was so crushed. I didn't do well with rejection on a scholarly or a level of writing. I'm a writer, and I really couldn't handle it. So I stuck it in a file drawer, and I was not planning to do anything with it at all. And a friend of mine said, who's an astrologer and so forth, she said, it's going to get published. And I said, well, I don't know how that would happen because I'm not shopping it to publishers. She said, oh, it's going to get published. And I was like, whatever. So going forward a few years, I took a job at Naropa University. Have people heard of Naropa?
Yeah.
You have, yeah. So Naropa University is in Boulder, Colorado, which is where I was living at the time, and I live near there now. And it was founded by Allen Ginsberg, the poet, the beat poet, and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was a Tibetan Rinpoche, or great teacher, who escaped from Tibet in '59, and he went to Oxford and, got his degree there and so forth. Then he came to Boulder and set up a community of students. And so Naropa was founded probably 35 years ago, at least, maybe 40 years ago. And it's a very progressive kind of school. They do give degrees, but they also have a program where they invite well-known spiritual teachers to give weekend workshops and so forth. And that was my job. I got to decide who to bring and invited them. And one point I invited Margaret Starbird, and she came. And so I got to spend a lot of time with Margaret Starbird, who is the author of The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, one of the first writers and historians. Whatever you think of her history, she is a historian. To come out with Michelle on Mary Magdalene as being the bride of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I also taught a class on Mary Magdalene at Naropa and taught in the religious studies department. And at one point, a publishing company in Boulder called Sounds True, you may be aware of them, they do a lot of audio tapes and experiential books and have quite a range of authors. They had contacted me and they said they want to do a book on Mary Magdalene and practices around Mary Magdalene. And I was like, oh, well, I know about that. And they said, well, do you have Margaret Starbird's phone number? They didn't want me because I have no name in the field, And they called Margaret and she said, I don't know anything about practices. I'm a historian. You should call Siobhan. And so they contacted me and they offered me a contract to write this book, which is my first book, Evoking Mary Magdalene, Accessing the Wisdom of the Divine Feminine. And it's basically a path to working with Mary Magdalene through her different aspects. And and I talk about kind of the Gnostic Magdalene, the Dark Magdalene, how to set up an altar, very practical things, and prayers and rituals, some sort of on the more pagan type rituals, Gnostic rituals, the Gnostic Rosary of Magdalene. And there's a CD in it with some practices that I recorded. So, and they timed it so it would come out with the Da Vinci Code movie. So this came out and it kind of pushed me into the Magdalene world more and more, because while I had planned a very scholarly book, I feel like Magdalene kind of pulled that one back, and I was directed to write a more experiential book, and in a way that people could actually invite her into their lives and work with her directly. And a couple years after this book came out, I wrote another book with Tal Malachi, who is a Gnostic bishop in the States, and on Gnostic healing. After I wrote that book, I had an internal experience where I don't really know how to describe it, but a big one. And all my desire to be a scholar just dropped away, to be working at that more kind of elite level with this material. And I stopped doing any kind of scholarship, and I actually pulled back from spirituality and religion in a big way in 2009. And so this is the first time since 2009 I've come out and talked about Magdalene again. And it's so interesting that this email came from Thomas, and I'd never heard of him. I didn't know anything about this, and it was to me as if Magdalene was like, okay, the time is right for you to come back and be more kind of an emissary, like we all are in this room if we're interested in introducing Magdalene to the public, which is something I am very interested in doing. in this book, I don't take any sort of stance on who Magdalene is. I present a lot of possibilities. I leave it up to the reader. I don't say this is, who she was, this was her role in Jesus' life. I've never been interested in whether or not she was married or had a child. It seems kind of beside the point, although I understand that impulse to know. And I used to be very much into not worshiping her, but venerating her, which is sort of a different, holding her up and honoring her in a very elaborate way with ritual. And I had quite an altar for her, quite a complicated altar. And now as the years have gone by, these last almost 10 years, my approach to her has gotten very stripped down, as has my approach to spirituality. That even though I did study Kabbalah and alchemy and Western esotericism in great detail and memorized, all the things that you memorize when you're doing that sort of work, I don't concern myself with those anymore. Not that that's a wrong thing to do or detrimental or anything, but it's just, for me, it's extraneous at this point. So anyway, I'm talking and talking. Does anyone have any questions at this juncture?
I think what's so beautiful about what you're saying is that you've really just embodied your own divinity, and that she was the archetypal energy for you, and now that you don't have to ritualize anything and stuff, it's just a part of your presence. It's it's just become a part of your presence, so you don't really need all the hoopla. It's just like it just is. It's just that you've come into that I am consciousness of what she has relayed to you. Through whatever your experiences have been. I think that distilling it down to its simplest point is that I am the I am. I already am all that is. And the saints are, ways that we can see how we can move into our own sense of spirit, divinity, wisdom, and they're just the outer kind of reflection of what we're being called to do within. So I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And this thing about publishers saying, you're not well known enough to write about this stuff. What a joke, And I read a lot of Cathar stuff before before I actually wrote the book. And man, when academics get their hands on it's a good one. But I mean, this Stephen Runciman, he apologises for what the Catholic Church does. He thought they were justified in crucifying the Cathars because, they believed in a different religion. They didn't believe in the resurrection, And it's happened to me before when, I've submitted stuff to publishers and they say, well, if you're not Karen Armstrong or if you're not so-and-so, you can't write books on this sort of stuff. They don't sell well enough.
Yeah, I was fortunate that I had been writing for Gnosis magazine for quite a while, which was a journal of the Western inner traditions and other places. But yeah, of course they want, it's all about making money. I mean, and, transmitting spirituality, but
By the way,
there is the bottom line, of course. So, yeah, thank you for that. That's interesting. Yeah, and people shouldn't, also I think people shouldn't lose heart if they have a book idea. I did lose heart. It was really something beyond me kind of reached in and said, this book needs to come out for whatever reason and you're going to write it. But, I didn't have the faith in the book. I was really looking at it as a monetary commodity, as a commodity that would bring me tuition money. I didn't really have a kind of an inner sense of this would go out and help people. So maybe that's another reason why the first iteration didn't really go anywhere.
But I learned from my experience, and when I discovered Damn and Her and was writing that book, I actively sought out about 3 different publishers, you know, and then someone else suggested that I should go with HarperCollins. And it was nice because I was in a bidding war.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's very nice when
very
that
nice,
happens,
yeah.
you know.
Right.
Your agent rings up and says, it's £4,000 now. Oh, it's gone up to 6.
Yeah, I didn't have that.
No, well, you know,
But yeah,
believe and it comes.
yeah, maybe it'll come now.
I wondered if it was possible to characterize the kind of interest you found at Naropa among students in Mary Magdalene.
Sure.
Is there some kind of profile that would be helpful for us?
Well,
or
you know,
not?
it's interesting because Naropa, like many schools, has their academic programs. And I did teach a really hated seminar in the religion department called Theory and Methodology, and the study of religion that was required that, you know, nobody wanted to take because they all wanted
because
to
it's
take.
too important.
It's too academic. I mean, the profile of Naropa students tends to be, you know, young and often newly converted to Buddhism, and they wanted to do things like, you know, engage Buddhism for social justice, whatever. But I taught the Magdalene course in the external studies class,
I see.
in the external studies college, sort of adult education wing. And so there I got a lot of different people that were interested, and mainly women, and we did keep up a group after the class ended, and we would get together and do ritual and get together on Magdalene's feast day and so forth. And that's one thing I'm going to cover in just a little bit. Is the title of the talk is Invoking Magdalene's Energy for Today, and a big interest of mine is kind of what I called grassroots organizing. You know, I see the Magdalene movement as a very non-hierarchical grassroots kind of movement that has many, many facets. And I would like to, I'll talk a little bit about this more, but I'd like to see people who are really committed to Magdalene and who have this interest is to make opportunities available for others who want to connect with Magdalene and in their communities, you know, face to face. And so that's something I'll discuss a little bit later. Yeah, so it was, I think it was to answer your question, Bruce, it was more, you know, women who were, you know, in their 30s and 40s and above who maybe had read Margaret Starbird and were interested in learning more. And I also taught a class on Gnosticism, ancient and modern, and so we got kind of the same sorts of people who are exploring these topics. So since I've left behind kind of the more elaborate ritual aspects of my work with Magdalene, my concept of her has also changed. So I saw her much more originally as, and these are not to say these are misconceptions, my conceptions changed of her. And I think everyone going to have their own relationship with Magdalene. I do believe she's still very much alive. She's obviously, to me, a spirit being. And she often works within the imaginal realm, and most of you, I think, are familiar with that. I will talk a little bit about that. But I think that she came for a couple different reasons, and I do like the concept of the co-savior. Some Gnostic groups and modern Gnostic groups talk about Jesus and Magdalene coming together as saviors for the human race. And what I mean by saviors is not the Orthodox Christian version, but more the Gnostic version, in that some of the Gnostic groups, because there were many Gnostic groups and they didn't always agree with each other. And they had different views, just like there were many Jewish groups at the time, in the early days in the first century, and many Christian groups. So we can't really say Christianity and Judaism. Scholars often will say Judaisms, Christianities, Gnosticisms. But some of the Gnostic groups saw Jesus as coming down as a way shower, as breaking through what we would call now maybe the matrix, the sealed sort of self-referential world where no outside information gets through unless there's an inbreaking, a divine inbreaking that breaks open this our closed world, if you could say that. And new information comes to help people become enlightened and aware of their actual situation. So I see Yeshua and Magdalene coming in that way, in that they brought light, they brought realization, they brought information from, in Gnostic terms you would say the true God, as opposed to the demiurge or the maker of this world who is separate from the true God in much of Gnostic theology. And I also see her as very, very human. And when I work with her in meditation, when I meet with her in this imaginal realm, which is the realm that many of us go to when we're in meditation or when we're reading myth and dreaming, and it's this realm that is neither purely spirit or purely material, but it's the intermediary realm. And to me it's as real, as ontologically real as any other realm that you can feel and see. And this is where I meet the spirits that I work with, including Magdalene and Yeshua. For me, Magdalene was a Jewish woman, and since I'm Jewish, I relate to her on that sort of tribal level. And then she was a healer and an exorcist, and just a very real person whose feet walked the earth, walked the Holy Land, that got dusty and sore as she traveled with Jesus and taught and healed and exercised. And so when I think of her now, when I work with her now, she's clothed in just very simple homespun robes and a shawl, and she's very, one-focused on her mission and her work with Yeshua. It's not that I see her any longer in sort of this resplendent black and red, attire as some kind of heavenly queen, which she may be, but for me, I like to work with her in a very simple and kind of stripped down manner. Does anyone have questions at this point? Or comments? So I think one of the things as we get more into bringing Magdalene to those who are interested in her is really talking about our personal experiences, our experiences in meditation with her, our healing experiences, or whatever kind of work we do with Magdalene. I think that's what people are hungry for. Of course, scholarship is very important to undergird some of the teachings and realizations, but for most people, they want that contact with the living Yeshua, the living Magdalene, and how they want to know how it could transform their lives. And many of them have already had experiences with Yeshua and Magdalene and have no context in which to express it or share it or have community with those of like mind. So now when I work with Magdalene, we usually meet in a walled garden, and it has date trees, pomegranate trees, a fountain that trills and burbles, and some very simple wooden plank seats. And she and I sit across from each other and we talk. And Yeshua is often in this garden, but he's kind of walking around or doing other things. Sometimes he's sitting next to her and he'll speak a little bit to me. But I see her as my main spiritual teacher and confidant. And she often I'll ask questions, she'll give me answers, and I find her guidance really very important, primary in my life. So so basically I work with her every day. But like I said, I no longer do rituals, or I don't even burn candles, or have statues or pictures of her around. If I could find a good picture, I would put it up, and I'm looking for that. I was just gonna. So anyone who wants an experience with Magdalene can access her. She's very available. You don't need to go through any sort of austerity or learning program. She's right there. So, and those of you who work with her know that. And one thing that experience I had recently with her was that when we were in meditation together, she opened a wooden gate, and she'd had me walking down this empty, dusty road with her, and her hands were up like this. And a couple days later, I read a phrase from Rumi that seemed to illustrate what we were doing. And the phrase in Rumi is, silent, absent, walking an empty road, all praise. Mm-hmm. And so which is a reference to the Sufi way of walking the inner paths. And what you get to eventually is silence, is the void, is pure godness. And to me that was such a wonderful moment, and I think that's what she can bring to people if you invite her into your lives and other people invite her, is that she's a very astute teacher, and she may teach you other things as well. But ultimately, the followers of the way, of the Yeshua way, of this way of realization, it's ultimately very simple and very silent. So, does anyone have any comments or questions?
I think that when you're talking about bringing her back into the community, I think that's really relevant and really important right now. I taught we had a gathering in California, and there was probably 22 women, which I thought was really interesting. And more than 70% of the women never even knew who Mary Magdalene was until they came that night.
Oh, really?
They knew that that they were interested in the divine feminine and the archetypal energies of the divine feminine. And I was shocked when I went around the room and I said, and who is Mary Magdalene to you? Just to get kind of,
right.
I don't know who she is. But they left knowing because they had an experience, their own experience in that moment. They go, well, now I'm going to really, investigate this more. And I just think it's really important. So what you're saying is bringing that into community and having gatherings.